There are books and books explaining in detail, tedious detail, what prayer is and isn't. And mine isn't the first sermon to address this topic, and it won't be the last. But let's take a look at the Lord's Prayer, which we say every Sunday and which we'll say in a few minutes. It's the prayer that Jesus taught us. Now, Jesus seemed to always be in conversation with God, and his prayers were part of this conversation. His prayers began with God speaking to him, beginning a conversation, and Jesus feeling God listening to him as he prayed to God. Sort of a back and forth. In this way, the Lord's Prayer can be a perfect prayer. We all know it by heart. We all learned it as children and have said it 1,000 times. So many times that it's become a habit. But if we're quiet, really quiet, and try to feel God beginning the conversation when we say, Our Father, it's the beginning of the perfect prayer. I remember when my grandmother used to babysit me, after I was ready for bed, she would come into my room and sit on the side of my bed and say, let's say the Lord's Prayer together. Now, this isn't something either of my parents would do. They just said, time for bed, Jimmy, and off I'd go. The next time I'd see them was at breakfast. We didn't even say a prayer at dinner time. Well, one night I got mixed up saying the Lord's Prayer, and I sort of forgot where I was. My grandmother said to me, you aren't listening to yourself say your prayers. Let's try that again. I had no idea what she was saying, but the next time and every time after that, I said my prayer perfectly. I paid attention to what I was saying. I listened to myself. But what she really said stuck with me. And many years later, I began to understand, I think, what she meant. Recently, in a book club I'm in, we read Falling Upward by Richard Rohr. He's a Franciscan priest. He talks about feeling God's beatific gaze and then reflecting that gaze back to God when we pray. He's saying that God begins the prayer by gazing upon us. In some ways, I wonder if my grandmother was saying the same thing. Conversations, good conversations, are about listening. They begin with listening. I listen to you and I respond. You listen to me and you respond. If I just jump into talking, I may miss what you're talking, where you are and how you're feeling and what's on your mind, and I just run right over you. If good conversations begin with listening, prayer begins with listening. Now, God knows our prayer before we speak, before we even know our prayer. We can feel God listening to us before we speak our prayer if we are quiet, very quiet. And then we can speak our prayer. In this way, prayer is a back and forth, but always beginning with God. It's not me telling God what I want and God saying, okay, or well, not now, or if you're a good boy, you'll get this. It's not that. It all starts with God, not us, not me. My prayer doesn't start when I say, Dear God. It doesn't start with when I say something fancy like, Gracious and merciful God, which is when we think the prayer usually starts because, well, that's what's printed in the bulletin. That's what looks like the beginning of a prayer. As I said, any good conversation starts with listening, and in this case, the prayer starts with us feeling God listen to us as we begin to pray. In this way, prayer has nothing to do with talking, nothing to do with words. It's not like a phone call, or these days, nothing to do with a text, or heaven forbid, nothing like a Zoom meeting with everyone unmuted. Nothing like me saying a few words and then you saying a few words and back and forth and back and forth. Then I respond and all that. We're not trying just to figure out magical words that will make it up to heaven and get God's attention. It's not about the words. My grandmother could have asked me, as sort of a test, Jimmy, what did you just say? No, she knew my attention had drifted, and she could have said that. I could have smugly answered pretty correctly. I could have said the answer. No, she said, you aren't listening to yourself say your prayers. That's different. Prayer begins with us feeling God beginning to listen to us. This takes some practice, feeling God listening to us. And remember, if we focus on what words to say in our prayers, we will go farther and farther away from the prayers. But if we're quiet, really quiet, and we focus on feeling God hearing us when we begin to pray, we will be praying as Jesus taught us to pray. Our prayer will be simply a conversation with God, begun by God, feeling God listening to us pray to God. Oh, and by the way, the guy didn't hit a home run, and my son and I didn't get our beer and hot dog. But then I didn't actually say a prayer for the home run either. So we'll never know what could have happened.